Schmidt, the winter commencement at Middlebury, and they asked me to write an introduction. That was, but I didn't think they were going to read it. I thought they were just going to put the program.
They had to pay some music.
So thanks for coming. So when Kathy approached me in the fall about talking about polarization, as Anne described, like my research, and so I've got 3 caveats just to let you know. Don't get your hopes up a little bit. My field of research, I mean, as opposed to Barbara Hofer, who's talking about her book, like this is an interest, and it's something that overlaps with the classes I teach, but my research is in some ways a little bit different. So, so maybe my presentation might look a little different than standard academic stuff, and maybe that's good, and maybe it's bad. But I'm going to tell a kind of story that's my effort to kind of synthesize various things that I find interesting, but I'm not trying to tell you a definitive version of it, and maybe at least get us to think or to talk about it in certain ways. Second caveat is when I agreed to do this, we shouldn't touch that, sorry. It was before I agreed to teach an extra class at Middlebury. We're kind of over enrolled. There's too many students, and so, which means I taught 3 classes already today, and so I'm a little bit. And the other caveat is, again, I've got sort of a very sick pet at home, so. So anyway, I'm just telling you, if it's a disaster,
You're here.
It's not a disaster.
You're here.
So I'm going to talk, I mean, polarization when I was approached, I mean, I think, like, I want to talk about through the lens of particularly talking about race. I mean, there's a lot of other ways to talk about it, but for me and my interests, I mean, we start with, and like, you know, and so the question is kind of thinking about how do we go from this, right, like 2008, this kind of moment, at least for some people, a celebration, and even, right, this headline of the New York Times, right, racial barrier, right, this kind of discourse that kind of surrounded Obama. Right, to 8 years later, and Trump's victory, and is in some ways not just a barrier to kind of the goals that people imagined under Obama, but in some ways a reversal of. And particularly, right, sort of to think about post-racial, right, which is the discourse, the kind of language that was being used, not only, but particularly kind of took hold after the election of Obama. And I'm sorry, my sort of desire to kind of play with colors is kind of not working. So, normally, I mean, my students get, like, I actually, like, play with, it's like, op-art stuff, and, like, but I spared you that, for the most part. But in some ways, right, we can see this kind of moment, like, of non-polarization, which actually masked polarization, which is that kind of everyone wanted the post-racial story to be true. In some ways, right, kind of liberals wanted it to be a story of overcoming and eliminating racism, right, a kind of triumph of all that makes sort of America great. And from the conservative side of view, again, there's, you know, cynical and less cynical reading, but in some ways they wanted a story in which race was no longer kind of a legitimate factor for understanding how the world worked, and so it kind of displaced it. And so the argument, that's not just mine, but you know, this unity was actually masking, in some ways, kind of exacerbating a certain tension, right? By taking race and or racism off the table, it, you know, allowed problems to not be named or not be specified in ways that made them not just impossible, not just harder to notice, but even harder to actually address. And for some people, that may have been a good thing, but in general, the idea was that the post-racial, this moment of unity, was actually, in some ways, what was seen as this triumph, and the solution was actually kind of the problem that brought us to the kind of sort of crisis. And like, I'm making all kinds of assumptions, and like, of course, for some people, 2016 is not the crisis. It was kind of, you know, the solution, and so feel free to recognize my bias and reject it if you'd like, but I'm not going to mask it. So Eduardo Benia Silva, who's a sociologist at Duke, wrote this kind of famous, I mean, like, there's no famous sociology books, really. Famous in sociology circles, a book called Racism Without Racists, which is in some ways, right, like he actually published this before Obama's election, and actually another version came out of it about after that, but sort of thinking about like how in a world in which no one sort of claims to be racist. And again, 2016 reversed it a little bit, right? Because like it's like to claim to be a racist, or at least that racist ideas was no sort of lost some of its stigma. But definitely kind of in the late 90s and early through kind of mid 2010s, right? We had kind of a world where supposedly there were no more racists, but the racism was propagating in some ways, not despite that, but because of it. And Benia Silva's argument is primarily discursive, right? I mean, it's a really interesting book that looks at the ways people learn to talk about race without talking about race, and to frame these kinds of critiques in ways that are socially palatable, but still make similar kinds of claims. Because one of the things that we find, and this has changed a little bit, but not so much, right? Like the worst thing is to be a racist, right? But of course, the really worst thing is maybe even more worse. Sorry, fidgeting. Is to call someone a racist. Maybe even the really worst thing, which we'll get to, is to call America racist. And so I heard y'all talking about birds in Florida before, and like one part that's not in my bio is that I am from Florida. I grew up in Florida. And my mother and my brother, 2 brothers are still there. But it's very, I mean, it feels quite, it's not, I mean, Florida wasn't great in the 70s, but it feels really removed from, and that, so apologies for this, right? Like the kind of, I want to talk about 3 myth understandings, or 3 myths, and then I couldn't decide, so I mixed them. I want to talk about 3 kind of misunderstandings or myth understandings around the post-racial that I think kind of propagate the problem, and then to think about one version of polarization, a kind of narrative of polarization that I think contributes to this, that at least I would like to complicate and maybe complicate along with you today. So the first one is kind of like Obama and Martin Luther King and everyone, right? Like the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. This kind of teleological understanding of progress, that progress moves forward. And it's nice to believe that, and like we can have evidence of it, but of course, the truth of the matter is that the arc of history can be bent in any direction at any time. There's no necessary reason that life is going to get better. In fact, there's all kinds of reasons we might suspect it's going to get worse, right? But it sounds great, and Americans in particular love these kinds of narratives, but that kind of teleological understanding of progress, right? That progress moves forward, and then once it's secured, like you don't have to defend it, right? Like ever onward, ever upward. And so this kind of belief, is not just ideological and problematic, but it also kind of makes people perhaps comfortable, and particularly kind of white folks who might not see or notice or felt like, well, the civil rights, that was, once we've solved that problem, there's new problems to solve. When in fact, right, to the extent that the arc of history, once it is going to keep bending towards justice, that's a constant struggle. And one narrative we might sort of pull out is like constant struggle. Is it like in some ways kind of allows polarization, right? It kind of demands a constant struggle. Although I'll invert that later, so that's not. The other thing is that racial progress defeats racism. And so this is sort of added to that first one, but it's sort of like racial progress comes at the expense of racism. There's a piece written by Ibram Kendi, who maybe some of you are familiar with, a historian. He was, I think now he's at somewhere in Boston, like he was at American University, their kind of anti-racism department. But I think it was actually published on the inauguration day in 2017. They made the argument that that basically the racial progress produces racist progress. And of course, like we don't want to deny all the racial progress that's happened, both before and after and during the civil rights movement and other kind of black freedom struggles. But the racist progress happens alongside with it. Right? If we wanted to be Hegelian about it, we could talk about the dialectic or something, but we don't want to be Hegelian about it. But just as sort of like the idea that like this doesn't that it actually spurs it, right? That like we see new way, right? Like there's new ways to kind of reproduce kind of racist structures that no longer fit, based on racial progress. But that doesn't mean that sort of racism is dead, right? And it works in the other way too, right? So that progress sort of comes pushes back sort of racism, but like a new form of it. Myth 3 is again to think about like that sort of to overcome racism requires the end of race. And this is kind of the post-racial ideology in this moment, right? Like we're after, it's not just, because it's specifically not named post-racism. It's called post-racial. And those things are conflated in ways, and again, if you wanted to like sort of dig into the academic debates about the chicken and egg, of which comes first, racism or race, there's all kinds of ways to conceptualize this. But here's this idea that racism, like, in some ways, kind of racism, once we're past it, right, because racism is either a cause or an effect of race, and to get past racism is to eliminate race. And again, we can have a conservative version of that and a liberal version of that, and maybe some non-denominational version of it, but it's quite popular. And one of the problems of that, right, of course, I couldn't come up with a good image for this, sorry.
It would be hard to beat the last image.
But this idea, right, that this, that of course race is a product of racism and is sort of, but it's also the basis of kind of the communities that resist it. And like if you can't talk about race and you don't want to recognize race, and there's a really, I don't know, I think it's a great book, you might, but at least it's an interesting book even if you don't agree on its greatness, by Margaret Haberman that came out a couple of years ago called White Kids, that looks at the socialization of white kids, like how they learned about race. But particularly looks at kind of conservative kids, and like in some ways they're taught and they learn in school and by their parents that like even to use the word race is racism, even to talk about it. And so like in some ways they've kind of deeply internalized this idea that even to talk about race is a form of racism, to recognize it. And we can understand there's ways in which recognizing race is very much a form of racism. But think about all the kind of positive things and identities and communities and achievements and experiences that get denied in that very moment, right, the kind of erasure. And so the idea, again, that removal actually is more effective at removing kind of the basis of kind of various kinds of claims and actually removing the racism that supposedly is after. And so the last thing, and this is like, right now we're talking about polarization finally, is in some ways that both sides do it. The kind of balance, understanding, right, that sort of propagate this sort of throughout our kind of discourse. In fact, this little image is inspired by sometime in 2017, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor came to the Middlebury campus about covering kind of America after whatever the Trump election, and I think they even had a Heartland reporter that they sort of, I was like mad about calling, right, who gets to be in the Heartland, but he drew a picture on the board like this, and then talked about radicalization or sort of polarization, and then kind of pushed them apart. And as I kind of argued with him, I mean, oops, come on.
Doesn't work backwards, huh?
Apparently not. Doesn't take two to tango, right? Like all it takes, right? Polarization happens if one side moves, the other side stays the same. And I think one of the difficulties is that, again, on one side, eventually both sides start moving in this narrative, but like this one side moves in a particular kind of way. And I'm normally quite pleasant, I think, but I was actually quite angry at this person, again, because he's editor of a, right, like he's making these kinds of decisions. But the worst thing is, and I felt he was kind of patronizing, he's like, well, let's just agree to disagree. Which just seems like a both sides, right? Like, I refuse, I refuse, right? But basically, because like that narrative is really kind of problematic. Because again, it's sort of, in some ways it's non-sociological, it's just like, well, this is how it happens. It's like we all move apart, right? It's like how relationships end, it's all these kinds of things. But it sort of misses the point that, especially the kind of whatever the good old days, and we'll come to this, and maybe, like when we think about, are we really worse off than we were 60 years ago when we talk about racial polarization? Certainly sometimes we talk about it as if we are. But the idea is like whatever the kind of bipartisan moment that we kind of celebrate is actually kind of an artifact of this thing called Southern Democrats, right? That they were sort of these weird things in between. So like Democrats and Republicans, so they kind of bridged space, but there are no Southern Democrats anymore in that same way. And so in some ways, like the two-party system masked that this polarization is happening. And in fact, of course, the racial polarization that we talk about today wasn't happening, but it was happening outside that space, right? Because everyone in Congress agreed, for the most part, right? And so the people who mattered agreed. And so here's our story of polarization in 3 acts. To kind of complicate this kind of just, we drifted apart. So the first one is just that. It's radicalization, and the thing about radicalization in particular kinds of ways. And there's a million ways to think about it, but for me, so as I explained at the beginning, or tried to explain at the beginning, most of this draws on classes I teach. So one of the classes I teach is a class on digital technology and its effect on the social world. And so a real clear space in which we see radicalization is online. And so the question is, how does online radicalization work? There's an algorithmic understanding of it, right? That platforms, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or all these kinds of things, or even almost anything, sort of, that they want you to stay on site. They want you to be engaged. And what engagement looks like, people who study this, right, find that engagement looks like giving you what you want, but a little bit more. And so engagement is actually about escalation. And so there's a researcher, Zeynep Tufekci, who's written several pretty good studies of this, but she has a TED Talk. But she looks at this, right, to say, like, if you're on YouTube and you start looking for vegetarianism, eventually it'll give you veganism, eventually it'll give you paleo, eventually it'll give you something. Because you don't want to keep watching videos about vegetarians, right? I mean, at some point, like, you got it, and they kind of push you. And some of us pull out, right? Ugh, vegans, no thanks. But if you're vegan curious at all, right, like, you're only a couple steps away, and ultimately, right, like, they're not, YouTube is not, as far as I know, invested in creating a lot more vegans. But in some ways, right, the idea is to keep you on the site, right, to sell ads. And to keep you on the site, like the model is, right, you get escalation. And so this is true for vegans, and it's true for white supremacists. And so algorithms, I mean, they target the vulnerable. I mean, again, sometimes this is just to sell us shoes, but it's also, I mean, they can, like, again, determine whether, people who are, I think the example that she uses in her work is, if you're bipolar, they can kind of figure out by your searches, like if you're about to sort of enter, kind of a manic phase or a depressive phase, and if they wanted to, they could target it based on that. And so, and again, there's all kinds of ways. I mean, I think a student in my class today was talking about, how TikTok sort of can figure out if you're gay or straight, and give you content based on that. And like, you don't even have to, and maybe you don't even know. But they identify based on these kinds of things, and kind of, in some ways, it makes you more of what you already are, but that's, I think, not true, right? In some ways, right, it's transformative. It makes you something, essentially, it can make you something different. And so Jessie Daniels writes specifically about this in her work, and looks at kind of how white supremacists, like, one of the big shifts is now comes to you. It used to be, I mean, like, it was always out there, but it was hard to find. If you didn't know how to find it, it was hard to find. I mean, like, so one is a Google search, and classically Dylan Roof, right, Googled black on black violence, and this led him down these kinds of rabbit holes that kind of radicalized him through. So we can be radicalized through Google too. But what happens is, like, the algorithms bring it to you. And it brings it to you in the comfort of your own home, right? So like the kind of stigma or difficulty of kind of reaching this stuff. And the other thing, and I don't know, I don't want to go too much into all this detail, but Gamergate, to those of you who are familiar with it, became this kind of space, right, which was primarily kind of misogynistic, but was still kind of a testing ground for this kind of space of kind of online harassment and building identity in these practices that became popular and kind of forming the so-called alt-right. And the last thing, right, which is just kind of follows from all this kind of stuff, that radicalization happens. I mean, when I wrote about the squatters, they got radicalized. And radicalization happens in all kinds of ways, but what happens is it happens faster and it spreads further. And, I mean, that doesn't necessarily go anywhere in particular, but we can think about, like, in the context of this shifting kind of political structures that we see sort of in the mid-2010s up till now, the fact that there then become sort of these public outlets for radicalization is justified and legitimated in various kinds of ways. That one important thing is not to get caught up, like the digital world is not separate from, right? Like they're reinforced in these kinds of ways. I mean, what we might think is sort of on the other side. I mean, it's not, kind of liberals, especially white liberals, right? Kind of the great awakening, right? This idea, right, that in some ways, kind of like racism becomes visible to them too, right? And I think Trayvon Martin and then Ferguson in 2014 were really important moments. Partially, again, like we can think about how it kind of made it so President Obama couldn't escape talking about race in particular kinds of ways, and that some people like that, some people didn't, right? Like when he said, like for example, I think Trayvon Martin looked like he could have been his son or someone, these kinds of claims that racialized Obama in ways that made certain people uncomfortable. But I think 2016 in particular became a moment in which kind of white liberals, their public opinion shifts dramatically on race. They're much more sort of aware of it and sort of willing to recognize that racism continues to exist as a problem. And Charlottesville in 2017 kind of reinforced this again, like white supremacists are no longer this kind of weird bugaboo that the people used to scare you, but they're actually sort of they're out there and whatever. And actually, the president was not distancing himself from them, and they were kind of embedded in these spaces that a lot of people wanted to imagine that we wouldn't have to worry about Nazis in 2017. And then I think the pandemic again is sort of another example, right, when you have these conversations about unequal sort of access to healthcare, who was dying, who was sick, who was unable to, who had to go out and work, and who could work at home. These kinds of conversations that reinforced the idea that race and racism still mattered. So the radicalization. So even though I said, well, it doesn't really take two to tango, we do see a movement. But the movement is not, as dramatic in one direction. One, we see partially a response, but it's also kind of driven, I think, a kind of technological one, right, that renders visibility. I mean, even the circulation of kind of images of police violence, for example, which we'll get to in a second. So this is a kind of a story of radicalization that kind of drives kind of the polarization. And of course, maybe like when Barbara was talking about her work, we could also talk about online stuff about information silos and various other ways in which we get stuck. We don't talk to people who are not like us. And in various kinds of ways. So I won't go into that too much because I want to talk about the summer of 2020. And I want to think about sort of the next stage and think about, in some ways, right, the center. We lose the center. Briefly. And what I mean by that, of course, we didn't really, there are plenty of people in the center, but sort of this kind of way of understanding it. You can think about, right, like the kind of protests that happened in response to the murder of George Floyd, but of course George Floyd was in some ways, right, like one example of like, a long history starting at least with kind of the awareness of the average American with Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin with the first kind of emergence of Black Lives Matter. Of course, it goes way back, right? Black Panthers initially are a response to police violence in their communities, et cetera, and beyond. This participation, right? The kind of the biggest protest ever. Millions, 5, 7, 10, depending on the count, right? And not just across every place in the US, but across the world. And again, you can read a million stories in the mainstream press about it wasn't just New York, it wasn't just San Francisco, it wasn't just Chicago, but small town, whatever. It was even in Vermont, not just Burlington, but everywhere, right? This kind of sense. And it felt like unity in a way, right? Like everyone, we're all against that, supposedly. But I do want to think about, right, the kind of binary system that we're sort of offered, right? Which is this, like, it becomes a debate not just about police violence, but about public space, and who belongs, and what do we remember, because we'll talk about history in a second. Sorry, I hope I'm not talking too fast. I apologize. But right, this kind of debate about the Richmond and the sort of Confederacy, and then kind of like how this came in, and I want to think about this, the sign, because I want to sort of zoom in on it, and I want to think about this as a kind of form of polarization. And what it is a kind of consolidation. That like this is not just Black Lives Matter, but like if I believe this, I believe all these other things, right? And so this is a kind of commitment to a particular kind of identity that's not just kind of anti-racist, but if you're anti-racist, then you're therefore anti-sexist, then you're sort of pro-immigration, then you're pro-science, then you're pro-water is life. I mean, there's a million of these sort of circulating around because like there's actually no necessary connection between any of these. We could imagine, right, like we could be fun, like we wanted to sort of be entrepreneurial, right, we wanted to set up a store on Etsy or something, we could make some sign like this and then just shove like some weird sentence in the middle. Like, you know, I don't know, like alien, you know, like any number of things and see how many we sell, and like it would be fun, and like maybe we would
Your next project.
the next project, right? But like to think about, like there's no necessary connection, but like the idea, right, the kind of, this is a kind of slippery slope, right? There is no center. Like if you're on the side, if you're against police violence, then you're against all these other things and for all these other things. And again, like the reality of it, people's reality is not like that.
Huh.
But there's a kind of this moment of kind of where this is, you know, this to the extent that we stood with that, or who anyone stood with that, then you said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I mean, that may very well be a true statement. But to the extent that we live our lives like that, it's completely false, right? Like, or it's completely sort of means that we're actually pretty okay with injustice, right? Like, if that's true, right, then like we're actually accommodated to that. So like, you know, in some ways that what's the word? Punchline at the end actually diffuses it rather than because it means like, well, but it sounds powerful. And I want to think about that power right there because one of the problems is the protest stuff and the lawn, and not just the lawn sign, and I don't want to critique the lawn sign people because they're nice, but definitely sort of serve a purpose beyond just like being performative or empty. I think that they're meaningful statements and meaningful act, but the protest was just too darn easy. And what I mean by that is like Tufekci, who I already mentioned, wrote an op-ed also in the New York Times after the Women's March, contrasting it with the March on Washington, organized by Martin Luther King, and said at some level they're equivalent. A large number of people show up in March on Washington. But the difference today is like you start with the big numbers, right? Like actually getting 1 million people on the streets is really easy right now. You send out something on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And actually, what happened, right, in March on Washington and other marches is that that was the end point of work. Whereas actually after the Women's March, most of the work happened afterwards. You said there was organizing, right? And actually what happens, we're not, like actually even though there are plenty of Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist organizations that were involved, right, they weren't actually necessary in order to get people on the streets. And so one of the differences, right, like that as an expression of political power, the March on Washington in 1963 was expressed, because if you can get 1 million people on the streets in 1963, you have, like, there's an organizational force, there's a strength there. And protest is so easy now, right, like that actually, there's no, like, the politicians should have no reason to fear 1 million people on the streets. I mean, maybe if they're running wild or something, right,
Yeah.
if they're doing sort of, but like as a kind of political force, it doesn't mean the same thing. And we fetishize million because million, you know, like it sounds like it's a big number and it's impressive. And when people said the protest was the biggest ever, like that was the marker by which we evaluate their strength. But of course, the strength is not the size. And one of these things that's too easy, and this is like whatever the third act, is to think about like why it didn't hold. Like why we have polarization, but it's not the polarization that it looked like in 2020. Shouldn't wear a tie. I wear ties like 3 days a year. I don't know the pandemic. Like normally, like I just like the past 2 weeks, I'm like, I want to dress up. But normally I look terrible. So, so the Big Tent short circuits. I was trying to figure out a pun with circus and Big Tent. This is the closest I can get. That Big Tents seem great, but one of the things is they're really hard to manage. That actually, it turns out we may all be against certain things, but when you ask us what we're for, we saw this, whatever, I mean, Black Lives Matter, always people are like, well, what are you for? What are you for? And when they say what they're for, we see problems. Same thing with Occupy, right? They refuse to kind of like commit to this thing. In some ways, right, as soon as you commit to something, you start alienating people in the group because they don't all agree. Or you have to have a process through which you can make these decisions. So these leaderless movements are, you know, can be really powerful, but like it's really hard to make those kinds of decisions. Sometimes that's great, but it can create problems. And when you think about, right, like this dissipation, because like everyone was sort of had really strong feelings about the police on both sides, right, either Blue Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter, But within a few months after the protest, like the opinions kind of went back to where they started. That there was a little bit of a shift, but it really didn't stick. So the question is, why didn't it stick? And one of the answers, I think, is because protest was too easy. Because people got involved, but they didn't get involved, right? Like they were there, right? And so like there's a kind of something that I've been thinking about that I read recently from a work that sort of looks at the kind of technological shifts that, in all kinds of ways, that change, that sort of actually, when you think about social movements, and the reason I like it, I think it's meaningful, but it's also kind of wordplay, which I enjoy, right? This kind of shift from quote-unquote collective action to connective action. Like we're increasingly connected, but we're not necessarily collective in the same kinds of ways. And I think that we can think about, like, especially like during the pandemic, we feel it. Like there's lots of connectivity, like we're on Zoom all the time. But how collective, right? Like it's the kind of community that we took for granted 2 years ago, right? Exactly 2 years ago, right? It's harder. It's not that it's impossible. But sort of that dissipation, right, because it didn't stick, and part of it was like there was, tons of people got involved. I don't want to sort of claim that no one got involved, but the kind of conduits to it, and even if they got involved, what happens is something else, right? And then sort of apologies for like whatever, sort of methinks thou dost protest too much, right? But really sort of what we see is also that thou dost protect too much. And so there's this difference, there's this ideological shift, right, that people are still anti-racist, but they're not willing to give up their privilege. And so 2 examples that I want to talk about today, although there's a million examples, but these are examples I have, and I hope I'm not going over time. Y'all okay?
No, you're good.
Okay. I want to talk about schools. I want to talk about the critical race debate. I want to talk about homes, and then sort of white privilege more generally, right? Because again, it's easy to be against racism, but when when you have to sort of give things up, that becomes harder. Not that people can't do it, but that, when we think about like all this stuff is too easy, and like, but it's also hard to go back, right? So like one of the good things about being a sort of sentient being in 2022 and maybe every year is that we're able, just like with the lawn sign, we're able to reconcile contradictions within ourselves, right? There's the Walt Whitman, right? Like I contain the multitudes, right? Like we're not ideologically coherent, and so we've made our peace with that. And especially it feels like in 2022, and this is also the polarization thing, like the hypocrisy no longer seems like a big deal anymore. It used to be like a gotcha, like to call out people as hypocrites, and now it doesn't seem to matter so much. We're all sort of made our peace with the fact that we don't hold up to our values or whatever, as much as we might try. But I want to think about history, right? Those who cannot remember the past are encouraged to repeat it, right? This idea about like, why in particular the power or momentum from the summer of 2020, right, that sort of opened up this space, like, oh, the 1619 project, or like let's rethink about like not just take monuments out of public space, but like rethink how we learn and teach history. It seems like kind of an obvious kind of movement, and like why, and like all kinds of opportunities to happen, and yet it seemed not just that it failed, but it became like the space of a huge backlash. And so there's a whole bunch of like images that I like, whatever, right? We know this, but of course, and it's interesting because I don't know if any of y'all have seen like whatever, I think it's on Apple, like there's so many streaming services we can't keep them straight, but like called Lincoln's Dilemma. It's a 4-part series. It's basically a lot of historians and talking heads. But it's quite interesting, and I would recommend it if you're interested in the Civil War and these kinds of things. But what's interesting about this context is that in some ways it shows, it highlights it from the kind of professional historians, this kind of shift, right, towards like, in some ways kind of from, it wasn't Lincoln who freed the slaves, but it was sort of enslaved people who freed themselves, right? And this kind of push, whether fighting for the Union or sort of demanding, kind of more from Lincoln, whether it's from Frederick Douglass or sort of other populations, and like, right, this statue, which was in Boston, got taken down, right? Because it was deemed as sort of, again, sort of constructing a narrative that was deemed as false. So it wasn't just the Confederates who were taken out of public space. It was whatever the heroic, the great emancipator. But at least sort of professional historians, at least the ones they interviewed, right? Like there's a selection effect, that's kind of taken hold. And yet, right, what we really have is history written by the losers and like whatever, and losers, the Confederates. I grew up, and I was thinking about this a lot. I grew up in the South. I was born in 1970. sort of just after, right, like kind of the big civil rights moments, and like just thinking about like what, you know, my parents aren't sort of strongly ideological about anything, but like to the extent to which I was definitely not taught like anything kind of super negative about the Confederacy. And my partner, I think she's a classicist, and she's actually teaching a class at UVM on classism and racism. And it's quite interesting, she's reading this stuff to me, right? The way in which Confederates appropriated kind of classical Greece to kind of justify slavery. It's quite interesting. That like, you know, she's like, comes out, she's like, oh my God, this is terrible, right? But to think about this in particular kinds of ways, I have a bunch of other images, but I'm not going to talk about it. But this is a quote from W.E.B. Du Bois. So in 1930, so he's so those of you who don't know, right, Du Bois was born in Great Barrington in 1868, actually died, I think, the day of the March on Washington, so he was 95, he was in Ghana. But he was a sociologist, like me, but he was a good one, not like me, but started the NAACP, did enormous things, and so he wrote a book sort of rethinking the way we understood Reconstruction. And this was from the conclusion of that book. That book was called Black Reconstruction, which is again a kind of narrative, right? Like that the failure of Reconstruction was sort of attributed to black people, and he's like, actually, no. But it's a question of like, well, you know, like what is history? Is it just to make us feel good, or is it this kind of truth? And I want to sort of, whatever, this is the ignorance, innocence thing, but I'll get to this in a second. But I had a student in my class last semester from Guilford. I'll read this to you because I know it's small, but Guilford, Connecticut, that this is something that came out, right? This kind of debate, like, we want to keep politics out of the classroom and ensure a happy, uplifting environment for our students. That's why we reject adding programs in our classrooms that divides programs in our classroom that divides. I mean, I'm not going to sort of grammar nitpick. Divides our students by race. We embrace Dr. King's dream of a society that judges us by the content of our character. I mean, we can also think about the post-racial as this moment in which Martin Luther King sort of becomes appropriated by everyone, right? Like, you know, as a way to kind of, we oppose the forced introduction of a curriculum which assumes our children are inherently racist, and the outrageous claim that our nation was founded on oppression, not conceived in liberty. And this is Connecticut. Ideology of despair has no place in Guilford schools. I mean, this is like great stuff. Our young, impressionable children should never be taught to hate their own country, nor should they be silenced or intimidated for expressing their opinions. Guilford, I don't know, Guilford, I mean, like, it's pretty snitty, right?
It's money.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I want to think about, right, this relationship between ignorance and innocence, because there's another work by Jennifer Mueller, who teaches at Skidmore, that talking about racial ignorance, that ignorance is not the absence of knowledge, it's a way of knowing the world. And so one of the problems is when you think about sort of solving the problem of ignorance, we think about we provide information, and like there's this void called ignorance, and we stuff things in it. But Mueller's point, right, is that ignorance is actually a form of knowing. It's not the absence of knowing. And so we learn not to know, and we learn not to notice, and so it's actually harder to solve that problem, that form of ignorance, than one that's just the absence of information. And I think about this reading that text, right? The ignorance and innocence, I mean, partially they start with the same letters and they're almost the same, and so I like that. But also, right, the way in which the innocence of children justifies keeping them ignorant. And then when they become adults, right, because they're ignorant, they then become innocent. I didn't know. I didn't learn that, I didn't understand that. And so we can think about how innocence begets ignorance at the child level, and then as they grow up, the ignorance then begets innocence, and then it gets passed on, and then we can see more word games here, right, with begets and bigots. Maybe beignets too. So maybe that, right? But to think about this dynamic, and the thing is, when we talk about Guilford, Connecticut, and I'll start wrapping things up because I know I'm going on too long, right? This is not whatever, the Deep South. And in some ways, right, this defense is a defense of whatever local control and like, you know, just like, you know, and all the things that sort of good, white, middle class and beyond parents do to make sure that their kids have their best opportunities. When I teach at a place like Middlebury, there's the product of these kinds of decisions, right? And even, right, and so what happens with the big tent collapsing is like all of a sudden, like when, you know, we can think about why housing is so expensive, right, in some ways, right, because like if you own a house, you want the value of the house to keep going up. And so you defend it in all kinds of ways, which means they don't build apartment buildings in your neighborhood, or you actually benefit from scarcity. And when we think about who owns houses and who doesn't, right, there's a million stories there. So I want to think about, right, the house behind the yard sign, right, because the house behind the yard sign in some ways becomes an impediment to enacting sort of the values and ideologies of the yard sign. And so we have this kind of ideological split that looks a lot like polarization, but there's a middle there that's actually about protecting, right, that's not ready, willing, and able to move on to the kind of logical conclusion of the belief system. And again, this is not to critique. I mean, I'm a homeowner, although I decided, I have the benefit that I have no children, and I think they have that benefit too. And I'm trying to convince one of my sort of entrepreneurial students to set up this NGO that sort of to get sort of guilty white people to like give away their homes. And I tell my students that I'll write letters to their parents asking them not to leave them their homes in their will, and rather to donate them to kind of give them to people of color or whatever. Because the thing about like this, like we have this system that this is where for most people their wealth is right there. And it's really hard to give that up. And that sort of pulls people back. Because I think about this article that was written by a friend of mine, Mariam Kaba, in the height of the protest in 2020 about, yes, you're being literally abolish the police. And then I think about my neighborhood listserv. I live in the south end of Burlington. And like the fears of like, it astounds me. People send like emails to the neighborhood listserv, like someone rifled through my car last night. And they like took a CD or like change or whatever. And it's like, and they didn't lock their doors. And they keep sending these emails, not the same people, but people, it's like, why don't you, we've never lived in a moment where it's been easier to lock your car door. Right? But I think there's some kind of performativity, like we live in a safe neighborhood, like we shouldn't have to lock our doors. But the flip side, right, then there's this idea, right, like when they call the cops are angry because we tried to defund them. They're like, no thanks. As if like they were really gonna like put a stake out for like people who are rifling through like your change drawer, your glove compartment in your car. But I think that in some ways, right, this kind of radicalization, like the logical conclusion, because if you look at the history, Kaba's argument, right, is well documented and all this sort of thing. All the reforms that people proposed, we've tried. I just taught a class, I teach an urban sociology class, we talked about homelessness in San Francisco, that we could see like the sort of San Francisco sort of tried to solve this problem through like connecting social work with police. What happened, the end result was just that kind of mental health became kind of weaponized, and it became kind of enforced therapy, right? That like what happened is not that the police became more like social workers, but the social workers became more like police. Okay. So again, not that, but like, so this kind of radicalization actually leaves, in some ways, kind of the middle behind. And not just because they're unwilling to follow that, but in some ways, structurally, it's quite difficult. And so I'm going to wrap up now, even though I could obviously talk forever, right? Because things have never been worse and things have been better. So right now, I'm teaching a class on the civil rights movement. And we just read a book, parts of a book. We don't read full books anymore. Called Inside Agitators. It's by Dave Chappelle, and we read a section on the Montgomery bus boycott. And it's primarily about the role of white people, sort of in their support, and particularly the moderate white people, not the kind of heroic people whose names we know, right, who like were at the beginning and fought, but like people who just gave money or like gave rides or all these kind of things. And I was thinking about it in the context of the class and having conversations with the students in the class. We're thinking about, right, like, again, the kind of question of polarization, like this moment. And like, how can we imagine that we're actually more polarized around race than 1954 or 55? In some ways, right, the polarization is the fact that there's a shift, right? It's still polarized, but like, in some ways there's more white people on this side to experience that polarization. In some ways, right, like one of the privileges of being, in this space 60 years ago, it was highly polarized, but you didn't have to pay attention to it. So we're paying attention to it, and so it feels more oppressive, but maybe it isn't. Although maybe it is. So the problem is I don't have a great conclusion. But I was thinking about this because like one of the issues that was quite interesting in reading this, and we were talking about this in our class, is that the activists, so the black activists in Montgomery sort of recognized that polarization, ultimately, the white supremacy, the organizations that were based on white supremacy were actually fragile and stupid, because they would make irrational decisions that were much more likely to support kind of their white supremacy than sustain themselves. And so they were kind of vulnerable to certain kind of tactics. But the more important thing is that a lot of, in some ways that kind of a lot of the white moderates who were fine with Jim Crow, what happened is they weren't so fine with it that if you disrupted their lives, they weren't willing to see things. Because one of the things, and this is true with policing right now and all kinds of things, is that Jim Crow actually worked best because it was based on discretion. If Jim Crow was actually enforced all the time, it made everyone's life hell. Because actually there are all kinds of moments in which someone who didn't want to move, it's like, just let them not move. Let's just get to work. And in some ways what happened with the kind of de-escalation is it kind of forced a polarization and forced the white supremacists to enforce it all the time. That made the moderates sick of it, right? Like, it isn't worth it. It was fine when it was discretionary, when it worked to my advantage, but if we have to enforce it all the time, it becomes a pain. And I don't know what that looks like now. And maybe, in some ways, those are the easy things, right? Because what happened is, well, we fixed the bus issue, but then we just all quit riding the bus. I still ride the bus, although the bus schedule changed. The pandemic, it used to be there's a 6:30 bus to go back to Burlington, and now, like, it's 3:15. Can someone just makes my life easier? Because I'm like, I can't teach late. But like, what happened to that bus? I don't know. Anyway, that's a separate. But like, what happens is we fixed busing. White people quit riding the bus. We fixed schools. White people quit going to schools. We do all these kinds of things, right? And so maybe the moderates aren't so helpful after all. But I do think kind of polarization is the interesting way of thinking about polarization. I'll leave you with this because I've been going on far too long. Is that we also want to think about like the split not just between kind of the racists and the anti-racists, the conservatives and the liberals, but also the polarization within the kind of big tent. That what looks like ideological coherence actually masks a whole bunch of different material interests that actually will create challenges. And in some ways, is why the right wins more easily, because there's a coherence between ideology and material position that isn't true on the kind of anti-racist side. And that's like a strength of a coalition, but it's also a weakness. And it's one of the reasons why kind of polarization feels both stronger but it doesn't have the kinds of effects. It doesn't work the same on both ends of the spectrum. And so I really was hoping to have a more optimistic ending, but I think that the most optimistic ending we can have is that we'll be done, and like we can go on with our lives. So I think that's it. I mean, so thanks. I guess, if y'all have questions,
Yeah, questions,
I'm here for that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, wait.
Oh, yay, thanks. All right, so the floor's open. It's not 8 o'clock yet. We can stay longer than 8 if we have lots of questions and comments. So please, Linus is here. Yeah, Leanne.
I'm just thinking about you teaching at Middlebury College.
Yeah? What are you thinking
It
about?
must be kind of challenging.
For me, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. Like, it's not my background. Like, I'm a whatever state school. I went to Florida State, and dropped out, and then came back, and then went to UNC in Chapel Hill. And so like, I taught at Wesleyan before I came here, just as a visitor, and so that was my first experience with this kind of world. And I'll be honest, they tried to deny me tenure. And I don't make many claims about myself, positive claims, but they tried to say I wasn't a good teacher. And I'm not a lot of things, but I'm a good teacher, so that was just code words for I'm not a good fit. But I survived because my department supported me, at least. But the thing is, like, the students, I mean, they're in complicated material positions too, but they're very nice. And in some ways they're impressionable. And they like to be entertained, and so I'm entertaining. And something that minds get changed. But yeah, it's not, when I imagine like my life, I mean, in some ways my life is, again, super easy. But you know, you do it, the weird thing about being an academic is you have almost no control over where you end up. But it's a weird place like there, the elite stuff. But as a place to teach, it's fantastic. I mean, students are great. I mean, you know, they're nice, and I'm nice to them. And we learn a bunch together. You know, bracket out like whatever the kind of contradictions. I mean, like I said, we all sort of ignore the contradictions that make our lives too complicated, so that we can do the kinds of things we want to do.
You challenge them.
Yeah.
So when you had the slide up about the homes and, you know, how we should, you know, give our home to, I think that, but the other one was schools.
Yeah.
I think schools would be an easier
Sure.
thing if people would be more open-minded to lots of diversity and differences in schools for children.
Well, we thought about, right? I mean, because we can think about, like, I mean, we probably would not have a reliving of the 70s busing issue, right? Which is like we tried to solve it in that way. Maybe that was, you know, sort of too disruptive, but we could think about these kinds of spaces. And like, again, like I recommended Margaret Haberman's book on white kids. It's actually quite interesting because like she looks at kind of kids kind of and like in 3 different schools. I think it's like, you know, just like with social science, it's not really, but it's pretty clearly kind of Madison, Wisconsin, where she got a PhD. But 3 different neighborhoods and the types of schools, and there are, you know, as 3 different models of kind of like whatever parenting, good parenting or bad parenting. And then like there are, but even like the good schools, right, like in some ways this is the kind of Middlebury model, right? It's kind of heroic, right? The diversity becomes this kind of way of kind of share, like that raising everyone up to my level without this recognition that actually it requires a redistribution of privilege and wealth. But yeah, and like Middlebury, you know, all these kinds of places it would benefit that, but often the language of diversity sort of sidesteps the fact that resources aren't unlimited, and to actually share somewhat equally means that the people who have a lot of stuff won't have as much. At least kind of that. They might have other good stuff that's worth it, the trade-off, but that's harder. And I think one of the other things is that parents, and like again, I only experienced this secondhand, you know, I have siblings who reproduced. I mean that, and even like with Middlebury students, like, because from the outside I'm like, your life is so easy, right? Like and like the enormous anxiety that Middlebury students have. And I mean, part of it's constructed in various kinds of ways, but I think it's kind of real, that even like all the kinds of privileges that used to guarantee a decent life no longer feel like guarantees anymore. And so I think it makes like what are the home stuff and the school stuff, right, really much more kind of cutthroat. That, you know, like that there's this zero-sum game that makes it hard to kind of make these kinds of claims. And to the extent that even at a place like Middlebury, I think sort of the way in which they make a diversity argument, if you listen to it, in some ways, it's not a social justice argument. It's a kind of like, in some ways, that diversity actually improves the educational experience of the quote-unquote non-diverse students, right? That they have, in some ways, like a fuller understanding of the world. Maybe it makes them better managers later because they'll be able to handle people. But they never frame it through kind of social justice. And we can understand why. I'm sure the board of trustees would be happy with that. But like, you know, the diversity in and of itself is often seen as kind of a means to an end. It's sort of, it's pragmatic because it serves the purposes of the people in charge. And maybe that's the only way to get it on the table. But it also limits the ability, like what will count as kind of diverse, like the kinds of programs that you might set up in that way. But yeah, I mean, I'm all for busing. But you know, I don't know. It didn't seem to work so well before. And I'm not sure it was working better now. Your hand was up?
Yeah, I was just thinking sort of on the same question, but I worked at Middlebury College back in the late 70s, and the whole population seems quite different now, and it seems really healthy.
Yeah, I definitely, you know, I think that move is, I think it's a better place. But like one of the challenges is like the students who are like make it better, I think, often feel, right, they feel the burden of that, the responsibilities, right? Like for them, being at Middlebury is really hard. And like, and I talk to students who want to like thinking about transferring, like want to transfer like urban school or whatever. And you know, because like, and like, it's very different than like the question you asked, but like in some ways, right? Like I feel like I don't belong in Middlebury. Middlebury is a better place because I'm here, which I just completely egomaniacal, and I get that, right? But I see it more in my students. But like in some ways, I'm getting paid for the privilege, right? But I can't ask them to stay even though Middlebury is a better place. And most of them end up staying, because the interesting thing is like once people go through the process of transferring or applying for, by the time they like get a decision, they've connected to friends and networks, they found their place. But I think that there's a burden, right? And this was a burden, whatever that happened 60 years ago with integrating schools, like who's doing that first and what the risks are. But even in a place like Middlebury that's super posh and like whatever, it's a country club and this kind of stuff, that is definitely an improvement, even in the time since I've been here, which is 15 years, which is a much shorter time span. But the students struggle with that experience of being in rural Vermont, of being in a place like with very strong class distinctions, of, you know, like all these kinds of things, and like, and also the idea is, one of the tricky things is, and this is like my cynical thing, right? In some ways, it's actually being used as a way, it actually, one of the kind of unintended consequences, it actually challenges the mission of the liberal arts project, right? Because in some ways, the students who come from, or first generation, come from like not privileged backgrounds, are more invested in becoming econ and computer science majors because they want to make money, and they don't have the same kind of connections, and so it actually kind of makes those things stronger, like the kind of diversity actually makes us less intellectually diverse. But that's my fourth book that I will never write. I don't think that's a goal, but it's this weird unintended consequence, right? That it's a place that in some ways the liberal arts is a privilege, right? Like we live not in the quote-unquote real world, supposedly, and to the extent that the real world comes more to Middlebury, which I think makes it a better place, it actually challenges that mission, partially again because of like, it used to be and this really happened, I think, you know, in some ways we've never really recovered from what happened in 2008. The students have never gotten back, right? That the privilege of a place like Middlebury feels far less guaranteed, and it's probably never coming back. Probably the rest of the world is going, whew. But the problem is, like, I don't know if they're any better off either, right? So where that privilege is going, I don't know, maybe Harvard or maybe whatever, but the privilege is going up. And there's a book, I can't remember the author, right, about privilege hoarding. This is what's going on, right? That we like to imagine a world in which, like, we can create more privilege, but privilege is at the expense of others. And so that's not what privilege is. Privilege is having something more, so we can't all we can't share our privilege. I mean, we can use it to kind of undermine it, we can destroy it, but that's harder. And again, like I make this point, I'll get to you in a second, like with my students, in some ways, like I'm a classic example. Like I do everything to undermine my privilege. I have a bad haircut, I do all this kind of, I sort of spout ridiculous radical politics, I wear skirts, I wear all these kinds of things, but like I can't give it away. I can't give my white, middle class, highly educated privilege away, no matter what I do. Like, and some people, like, no matter what they do, they can't get, that privilege is no longer, not guaranteed. There's a great book by Tristan Cottom called Thick. She's a sociologist. She's also a McCarthy Genius Award winner. She's all these other things, but like she makes this claim, right? There's a black woman, right? Like no matter all these things that she's earned, in the end, she can't guarantee that she's going to be seen as anything other than the kind of ascribed status of being a black woman. And all these other things are kind of slippery. And in some ways, it's kind of slippery for me too. Like I can do all this stuff. I mean, my privilege is like when I walk out of the house in the morning, not like this, but I'm wearing a skirt and like whatever ridiculous. My girlfriend's like, what? Right? Because she's like sort of like knows that she has to like, she's constantly being judged. She has to dress nicely, and like if she doesn't, like she's going to get reviews and all this sort of, you know, like the students are going to won't respect her and all this kind of stuff. And I can't give it away. I can give it away. And that's like how, and so it's actually one of the kind of ironies, right? Like it's like whatever, like you know, whatever I do, in some ways it comes back to me twice. It's great to be mean. Which you know, I almost never say that. So. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to comment on, in our community, the schools are dealing with something called the equity, developing equity in our schools. And I think a lot of people originally thought that, oh, this is great, we're going to have a more diverse group of students coming into our elementary schools and high schools. But what it ended up, in my mind, looking more like who have the privilege and who doesn't have the privilege, and who wants to go to what school, and what, you know, who, it's caused polarization in our community, our county, because of that. And it's been interesting. I never thought that it would get to that, but
I mean, it's tricky, right? Because in
Yeah,
some ways,
sure.
right, like, you know, like, we defend our homes when we defend our kids, right? And like, again, it's rational, it makes sense. I mean, like, you're a good parent. And but the decisions that you make as a good parent, like, have, like, you know, sort of can have structural consequences that are not great. But like, those are far off and unclear. And like, you know, like, what are you gonna do? Like, you're gonna sacrifice your kid to like make a point? I mean, and like, and you're gonna do, like, it's one thing if you collectively do it as a community or society. But if it's at the individual level, I mean, it's completely irrational to make those kinds of decisions. And I think about from a different perspective, like my girlfriend was teaching, or grew up in the Stowe area and then went back and taught high school briefly before she finished her PhD in Stowe High School. And like to think about the secret ways in which sort of like whatever that they got around, right? That they had these parents fundraising things to buy things for the school to kind of get around like that kind of equal funding and redistribution, right? Like, you know, and again, like you can't, I mean, you can and I will, you know, fault parents for doing that. But again, it's hard to. And most people won't, especially because most people are parents and they understand those kinds of things. And so when we think about it, and so one of the things is, right, and like one of the challenges of the kind of polarization moment is that problems that can only be solved collectively, like we don't have the kind of collective basis to do it. Part of it is kind of the collapse of our kind of institutions as a democracy, but also other things. And so like, so when we make decisions, even good intentioned people make decisions at the individual level, they're much more likely to reproduce these outcomes. Because A, they might not know, but B, it's like, again, it's too big of a risk. Because, I mean, if nothing else, they need their kids to support them. So they better get a good job.
But they're also, as you said, they're also working towards more privilege for their own children.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Because again, like, privilege feels like, you know, like, you either share it collectively or you fight over the scraps, right? And like, we don't have a space to kind of do that. I mean, we could do it, but we don't do it. Yeah, and now, you know, it's like, and like the polarization stuff just, I don't know, makes it feel further away, right? Because like what it feels like, at least for some of us, and maybe me included, is that polarization, especially in the time of COVID, also feels like isolation. That, you know, there's a moment like with the Charles Murray stuff that happened in Middlebury, and I think, you know, like I was kind of whatever on a certain side and like helped students and then like had a brief kind of mini career kind of like speaking on this kind of stuff. But there's a moment where like some people are like, well, I want to get back to normal so that we, you know, kind of bridge this gap. And I, you know, was like, actually, I feel great. Now I know who my enemies are. Now I know. And that felt great for a while. It's good to know. But over time, you know, like, knowing who your enemies are and like, you're stuck with them. I mean, you make different kinds of choices and it's kind of, and there's certain things that like in some ways you can do with your enemies, whatever, that are not political necessarily, but once they're enemies, like everything becomes political, right? In a kind of way. And so the polarization makes, because when I go back, and I really do have to wrap up because my partners are making me eat dinner. That if I go back to the thing about like protest is too easy, there's another thing, like in some ways like what happens with the polarization is we're less likely to kind of spend time with people we disagree with. And that's, and I'm not trying to make an argument against like, oh, talk to people you disagree with. Because like, I think it's often sort of a waste of time. But what I mean is that like a lot of things that actually aren't polarized, we end up kind of avoiding because we don't want to talk about vaccines or masks or whatever. And so a lot of these kinds of incidental kind of socializing things that made us feel like we're all in this together, even if we agree to disagree. I mean, we lost a lot during COVID, but I think we've lost a lot kind of identifying like, you know, if you'll excuse my language, there's no fucking way I'm going to hang out with a Trumpist. Even if like we all are sort of share an interest in like whatever model train building in ways that we could sort of see each other's humanity, because like I don't want it. And so there's a little bit of loss because maybe he was the only one in town that had that interest. Or like all these kinds of things, or like whatever, these ways in which kind of the social fabric becomes unwoven as we polarize that actually aren't connected to the initial polarization, and make the polarization feel, and maybe structurally is, more insurmountable.
Yeah.
But like, that's not a positive ending. I know, so I better go, because like, I mean, I'm an endless font of negativity. So we should cut me off before I go.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Anyway. Yeah. Excellent, and your op art came through in your PowerPoint design. It's really nice.
What's up?
Awesome, awesome PowerPoints. And you made, I don't know about you people, but it made me look at things in a different way. I hadn't considered a lot of the things you talked about. And I will never look at those signs again without thinking like, and we believe in cute little ducklings or something.
Yeah, we
in
should
the
let,
middle.
we should.
So from now on, we're going to be
I
inserting
mean,
words
I'm giving
in
that
signs.
to you. That's yours. Anyone who wants to take that, like, I mean, I want a 10% finder's fee.
Yeah. So thank you so
Thank you.
very
Thanks a lot. I
much.
really appreciate
Yeah, we
y'all
appreciate
coming out,
you.
because I know, like, there's all kinds of reasons not to come out. And so.